In this video, we'll be showing how to disassemble and reassemble the conveyor system on a John Deere 1910 air cart. While this conveyor hasn't totally rusted through yet, in places it's already quite rusty, and since the bearings are rusted up and need to be replaced already anyways, it's a good time to upgrade the whole conveyor housing. By upgrading to a stainless steel conveyor housing from Romafa, it won't rust through like the factory original. Here's some before and after pictures showing the original steel conveyor and then the new Romafa stainless steel conveyor. Be sure to check out our other videos where we show the complete disassembly and reassembly of the entire metering area with new Romafa stainless steel components. We'll start the disassembly process by removing the hydraulic hoses from the conveyor. We recommend labeling each hose to ensure you don't mix them up during the reassembly. Cap the end of each hose to avoid spilling too much hydraulic oil. Also note to unplug the floodlight atop the conveyor and remove its harness from the conveyor housing. Move the conveyor out to operating position and remove the bottom spring pin. Then using a forklift, we'll lift the conveyor off its mounting arm, move it away from the air cart, and lower it onto sturdy sawhorses. Then we can remove the hydraulic hose brackets and take off the hydraulic controls. Remove the spring pin from the conveyor pivot shaft, remove the shaft, and lower the support to the ground. Unbolt and remove the conveyor tongue fixture. Next we will move to the top end of the conveyor and start with unbolting and removing the chute. Unbolt the drive sprocket shield and take apart the chain coupler. Then we can unbolt and remove the hydraulic drive motor. Remove the drive sprocket from the motor shaft, and then clean off and prepare the motor for later reinstallation. Loosen the conveyor belt tension bolts on each side, and then loosen the 8 bolts on the tension adjustment slots. It's likely to be somewhat rusted, but you should then be able to loosen the belt tension apparatus. The lock collars and bearing housings are thoroughly rusted on, so we will use a torch to cut through these. We can then remove the lock collar. On the drive side, we'll remove the set screw, and since the sprocket is also rusted on, we'll heat it up and use an air hammer to remove it. We'll remove the lock collar and bearing on this side as well, and then before moving to the other end of the conveyor, we'll remove the rubber-coated drive roller with its integrated shaft. Now moving to the bottom end of the conveyor, we'll remove the hopper components. Some of the bolts can be removed normally, and some need to be ground off. We'll drill out the rivets as well. Then we can remove the plastic hopper and wash it out so it will be ready to reuse. Next we'll remove the bolts around the bottom roller. These collars and bearings are also rusted on, so we'll need to torch them off. Once we locate the conveyor belt splice and remove the joining wire from the splice, we will be able to remove the conveyor belt. This belt is still in decent enough shape to reuse. Finally, we'll remove the belt scraper, which concludes our disassembly portion. You may wish to purchase a few extra components new and avoid spending as much time on the disassembly. We found that many of these parts were too rusted to reuse anyways. To begin our reassembly, we have set up the 2 halves of the new Romafa stainless steel conveyor housing on sturdy sawhorses and a work table. We'll slide the two halves together, and since this is a tight fit, in order to make a good seal, we'll use clamps to pull together the two sides. Next we can start bolting the sides together. It is important to use anti-seize on all stainless steel hardware. Ensure that bolt threads are coated with anti-seize before installing nuts. Failure to do so can result in thread galling, also known as cold welding, which typically renders the bolt impossible to remove without cutting the bolt or splitting the nut. Using power tools to pull two items together with a stainless steel bolt and lock nut is practically a recipe for thread galling, so anti-seize is a requirement on all hardware throughout the installation. You may wish to silicone the joint to improve the seal. Bolt on the conveyor tongue fixture, leaving the nuts loose until the conveyor is mounted, at which time you'll adjust and tighten the nuts. Position the conveyor support. Slide in the pivot shaft and install the spring pin. Adhere new warning and operating decals. Next, using a fish tape, we'll insert it into the top section of the conveyor housing and pass it through to the other end. Then, noting the conveyor belt's correct direction, using mechanics wire, we can attach the end of the fish tape to the end splice and pull it back through the top section of the conveyor housing. We'll repeat the process for feeding the other end of the belt through the bottom section. It might take several tries to get the fish tape through to the other end successfully. Then we can assemble the plastic belt scraper to its stainless steel bracket and install this in the housing. Next we'll assemble the bearings. We're replacing these bearings with a more durable greasable version. Bolt on the bearing flange, remembering to use anti-seize on the threads before installing and snugging up the nuts. Install the roller shaft as shown. If the shaft doesn't slide into the bearing, remove any rough edges on the shaft with emery cloth. Mount the bearing for the other side on the appropriate bracket, noting the location of the grease zerk, and positioning the bearing flange such that the zerk is accessible. Install the bracket and bearing on the shaft, and install the 4 bolts to fasten it in place. Make sure that the roller is centered in the housing, and then place a lock collar on the end and rotate and tap the collar in the direction of the shaft's primary rotation. Then tighten the set screw. Install the bearing cover and repeat the process on the other end of the shaft. Slide the Kevlar coated binding wire into the conveyor belt splice joint. Next, we can install the adhesive gaskets. This will provide a good seal for the hopper bin. After washing the hopper bin, place it on the housing and install the new stainless steel bolts. If any of the rivets between the hopper bin and the rubber edge have let loose, drill them out and replace with rivets or small bolts. Replace the hopper screen and fasten it in place with linchpins. Finally, attach the rubber edge to the stainless steel housing on each side. Before moving to the other end, we'll reinstall the hopper cover. Install the rubber-coated drive roller in the top end of the conveyor housing, with the keyed end of the shaft facing the drive motor side. Install the bearing on the slide bracket and mount on the conveyor housing. Don't quite snug up the slide bolts yet. Repeat the process on the drive side so that you have the bearings and brackets bolted on each side. With the roller centered on the housing, install lock collars on each side. Then on the drive side, install the keyway and sprocket with chain coupler onto the shaft. Install the bolts and mounting plate in preparation to mount the drive motor. And with the keyway on the motor shaft, bolt on the drive motor. In this case, due to the deluxe bearings being used, we're using a second mounting plate to space the motor a little further away from the housing to avoid having the motor shaft contact the second sprocket. You may not require this in your installation. Don't forget to tighten the drive sprocket set screws. Next, we can tension the conveyor belt. Use a caliper or measuring tape to keep each side consistent. How far you'll need to tension may depend on how new or stretched your belt is. Next, replace the top cover plate and install and tighten the bolts. Turning our attention to the top chute, we'll clean off the surfaces, removing any old gasket and scraping and polishing it clean. Then we can install new seal gaskets onto the chute. Once that is complete, we'll mount the chute onto the conveyor housing, and then bolt the chute on. On the one side we'll mount the floodlight, and on the other we'll mount the chute transport retainer strap. Next we'll mount the upper control handle, and then the top grab bar. Once the chute is firmly attached, we'll install the driveline cover plate. Mount the lower control handle and hydraulic control block and attach the hydraulic hoses to the conveyor housing. The mounting style may vary with different models. Now that the conveyor is fully assembled, we can reinstall it on the 1910. Using a forklift to lift and position the conveyor above the mounting arm, reinstall washer shims on the pin and lower it onto the mounting arm. Install the bottom washer and retaining spring pin. And with two people, move the forklift and gently lower the conveyor end to the ground. Next we can clamp on and reattach the hydraulic hoses. Taking care to follow our earlier markings. We'll now fold the conveyor arm to ensure it seats properly, and can then adjust the position of the tongue fixture and tighten the bolts. Finally, reattach the floodlight connection and zip tie the harness to keep it from getting damaged. Once the air cart is connected to a tractor, test the hydraulic functions and adjust belt tracking per the operator's manual. Always test all aspects of the unit upon completion before needing to use it in season. And with that, we'll conclude this video on the conveyor replacement. Be sure to check out our other videos to upgrade other components of your 1910 to stainless steel. We've tried to condense this video to provide a brief overview of what is involved and some tips along the way. It is not intended to be a replacement for the technical manuals. Expect what you watched in the last 15 minutes to take more than a day to accomplish.